Before I introduce the speaker, just to say that, since the 1800s, we human beings have contributed to what has been widely known as climate change. And it's largely because we've been burning fossil fuels like coal, gas, and oil. And the reason we need scientists is for them to tell us what is the impact of climate change on our lives, and also to help us mitigate the effects, the adverse effects of climate change, and perhaps even to ways of reversing it. So to that effect, we have an excellent scientist with us, Dr. Indu Murthy. So let me, Dr. Indu Murthy will be speaking on sustainable development goals and understanding of the ecosystem, interface, and trade-offs. So Dr. Murthy will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and we'll have about half an hour for questions from the audience. Let me very briefly introduce Dr. Murthy to all of you. Dr. Indu K. Murthy is Sector Head, Climate, Environment, and Sustainability at the Center for Study of Science, Technology, and Policy, also known as CSTEP, which is one of India's leading think tanks. Dr. Murthy holds a PhD in Ecology and Environmental Sciences from Pondicherry University, and she has also completed a Master's in Botany from MS University, Baroda, with specialization in forestry and environment, and a Bachelor's in Botany from Ethiraj College for Women in Chennai. So prior to joining CSTEP, Dr. Murthy worked as a consultant scientist at the Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru. And areas of interest include climate change vulnerability, land-based migration, and adaptation, resilience building, or climate-proofing development. Dr. Murthy is an expert with the UNFCCC roster of experts for India for greenhouse gas inventory, and she's also a steering committee member of the International Platform on Adaptation Metrics. She is Associate Editor, Frontiers in Forests and Global Change, and International Journal of Climate Change Strategies and Management. She's also the academic editor on the Plus One editorial board. Dr. Murthy is also on the governing board of the South Asia Consortium for Interdisciplinary Water Resource Studies, and is a technical advisory committee member of Mahila Abhivuddhi Society, which is in Andhra Pradesh. Over to you, Dr. Murthy.
So, very good afternoon to everyone. And I hope after the tea you're getting your energies back and you're ready for a slightly heavier session than the first session that we had. We touched upon science, technology, policy, the interconnections, the need for looking at it holistically, and then, where, one influences the other. So those were the conversations we had from morning. So now what we're going to be doing is putting all of them together and trying and looking at, what are the Sustainable Development Goals itself, as it's been framed by the UN, and then moving on to look at the fine interconnections between when you're looking at natural systems and also humans as part of the natural systems. So that's the interconnections, and also the lots of trade-offs. Some of the questions in the morning, we're trying to actually ask those as well. And it's been addressed. But then let's look at some case studies, some examples, how doing one can actually influence another. So those are the kind of things that we will try to look at during this particular session. So this is a term that you must be very familiar with, SDGs. That's something everybody talks about, be it the government, be it the businesses, be it people. Generally sustainability is a term that's kind of become quite popular, even among individuals like you and me, right? Sustainable clothing, sustainable ways of living, everything is something that we talk about. So how did this come about? Where did it actually start? So it's defined in many ways, but then the first one, the very definition of it came from what was called as the Brundtland Report, which said sustainable development is basically development that meets the needs of people or generally the present generation, without compromising on the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. Does it ring a bell? This is something, a leader in the Indian context actually spoke about this in a very different way. Does anyone come to your mind? Nature has enough for man's, right? Needs, greeds. That rings a bell, right? Mahatma Gandhi did talk about it. So I think different people at different points in time have actually touched upon this. And what it means to say is that we need to be looking at it not with a short-term vision, but look at it with a slightly longer-term vision. Don't just think about today, but also think about tomorrow and what it is that we are doing, what is it that's going to leave a mark, which might transcend to a resource probably not being available or the capacity of it being compromised over a period of time. Just to look at how it evolved, it all started with the 1972 conference, the UN conference that was held in Stockholm, when they talked about sustainable development. The United Nations actually put together a group which was speaking about sustainable development. Then came the Rio Summit. Now, this is something that's a lot more in the news in the I would say recent decades, particularly because it's about the climate conference, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and also the Convention on Biological Diversity that came in here. Now, both these Biodiversity Convention and the Climate Convention, as we all know it as, happened in 1992. And then, of course, in 1994 came the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. So, for the first time in the history of the UN, this was a legally binding agreement which was actually linking environment and development to sustainable land management. So there was a linkage that was being established out here. Now, as I already said, with climate taking center stage, a lot of conversations, whenever we are talking about development being compromised, whenever you're talking about what is happening to the environment, we talk of it in the climate context. So as I already said, everybody is speaking about sustainable development. So let's take a step back and look at how did it actually evolve, right? So first, of course, the Stockholm Conference came in, and then what actually was the predecessor to the existing sustainable development goals that you and I are clued into is what is called as the UN's Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs in short. Now, this was the biggest resolution that happened in 2000. September 8, 2000 was when it happened, when 191 UN member organizations and 22 international organizations actually came together and they pledged that they would achieve 8 goals by 2015. So what were these 8 goals? It spanned everything to do with poverty, hunger, disease, inequality, and environmental degradation. And they had a basket of these that they said, we're going to be setting targets, we're going to be doing something around this. So what really happened and what was achieved before we get into the SDGs itself? So what really did MDGs help achieve was that it did achieve a reduction in the poverty rates. You see the numbers there. I'm not going into the statistics here. And then, of course, the primary school enrollment of girls went up because of the MDGs. This is a global number, of course. I'm sure you would agree that across regions, even within countries, there could be great disparities, right? But overall, they saw an improvement in the goals and targets that they were set. And of course, mortality rate decreased, HIV infections decreased, malaria deaths were prevented during this period, and of course, improved sanitation and drinking water, people gained access. But we know for a fact there's a lot that still needs to be done in all of these areas, whichever part of the world you're looking at least for most parts of the world. Now, what the SDGs wanted to achieve that the MDGs could not achieve was that it thought of it as an optimistic blueprint which would help achieve global equality, policies and actions that would translate actually into action on the ground. Not necessarily just goals and targets and numbers, but things that would actually happen on the ground. And that's when 2015 MDG actually became the basis for the Sustainable Development Goals. And 193 countries pledged took the commitment to achieve these SDGs by 2030. So that's within our own lifetimes, right? And what was also done is that they set out 17 goals as part of the SDGs. Now, these are the 17 different goals that came about, right? And it also were built on 3 pillars of sustainability. What do you, I mean, from morning we've been hearing about this. Anyone in the audience who wants to say what are the 3 pillars of sustainability? Any volunteers? I would like to make it interactive. I think it would be nicer. No? No guesses? At least 1 or 2 pillars that you can think of? Okay, no worries. So 1 is social development, 2nd is environment, and the 3rd is economic. And from morning, we've been looking at all these 3 aspects, right? And all these 3 together is what makes up for sustainable development. You can't ignore one for the other. At the cost of one, you can't achieve another. That doesn't mean it's sustainable. And over and above this, the goals are also divided by 5 different thematic areas. There is people, there is prosperity, there's peace, partnership, and overall the planet. Now think of these sustainable development goals as a wedding cake, a 3-tiered wedding cake if you want to think of it. At the base is the environment, right? You have all these goals that are mapped out there. Now the base is quite large and on which are housed the societal goals and targets. You see a number of them that are mapped out there. That's your 2nd tier of the cake. If your base is, say, a chocolate base, that is what you like. Your mid could be a red velvet, whatever combinations you think of. And your top, right on top, is the economy. Whatever flavor you want, think of it, right? And that's what makes up the Sustainable Development Goals. So one is hinged on the other. Now, if you think of this, of the game, what's that classic game that people play where you remove blocks? What's it called? Something with J. Jenga. You pull out one, somewhere in between, you're upsetting the entire thing, right? And that's where the fine interconnections lie. So Sustainable Development Goals, if you think of it as a cake which is interconnected, where you have everything, and right in between you see is action that keeps them all together, right? So it's interesting and it's important to realize and actually understand that these interconnections are extremely strong, and upsetting one would lead to some adverse impacts on the other. Some that could be perceived immediately, but some probably after a long time is something that you might see. Now, in the context of a global nation, from the political side, or from how the nations operate together, why are these SDGs important? A, it encourages social mobilization. It creates peer pressure among political leaders, because somebody asked a question about ranking, technological, where does India stand? What does it mean? Now, even in that, if you want to look at it from that angle, yes, they do look at these indicators, they do give scores. We will see some of these as we go along. So it does create pressure among political bodies as well. And it spurs, more importantly, it will spur network of expertise, knowledge, and practice into action. I think that's what is extremely important. These goals are able to mobilize that. And of course, stakeholder networks, not just within countries or within sectors, but across countries, across sectors and regions, they come together for a common purpose. So that's where these goals are extremely important. Now, these cover a range of areas, but seemingly less tangible. They do look a little fluffy, right? They're very kind of, okay, that's a big goal. Poverty, hunger. How do we kind of achieve? So which is why the SDGs are again broken into very tangible 169 specific targets. Now, each of those goals that you saw again have multiple sub-targets, or if that is the goal, these are the targets that need to be achieved. So that's where it helps nations to move towards a certain goal. That's what this is all about. So these are extremely interconnected, as we already saw. So let's just look at a case study, right? How did some countries actually try and address a problem, and what were the multiple benefits that they came out of? Now, this is a case study of rural Lebanon, where they installed solar-powered street lights. Now, the goal of this action was primarily to improve safety for women who moved across the town or the city late in the night. That was the purpose when they actually rolled it out. But what happened is that it led to safer walking space for women, which also meant that there were extended hours of activity that women could engage themselves in, or they could enroll in classes. Education improved because of that. But more importantly, solar-powered lights is also an environmental friendly action at the end of the day as compared to fossil fuels that are used. So ultimately, what this led to is not just safer spaces for women. Gender inequality was not the only one that was addressed, but it also led to better job opportunities. It also led to better education. It also led to reduced emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, because there were solar-powered lights that were actually being utilized in this. And ultimately, when you have more education, more job opportunities, the economy improves. So again, these are extremely interconnected, which is what we see here. Now, again, another case of Peru where it is about garbage. How did they manage garbage? How did they go about doing this activity, which led to multiple benefits at the end of the day? So in Peru, they rolled out, there was a lot of garbage problem, like in any city, even here. Bangalore has this perpetual problem. I'm sure Chennai also faces the same problem, right? Now, what they did is they set up teams of volunteers, primarily women from economically backward sections of the community to actually go about and collecting, building awareness and collecting garbage, segregating them, and also recycling some of these and producing products that they could sell. These recycled materials led to A, skill development, B, jobs, C, economy, better incomes that these women actually came out with. So A, it addressed the problem of expanding landfills in a very environmental friendly way because there was a lot of recycling that was happening, and it also led to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Landfills are a source of methane emissions. Now, methane is a greenhouse gas. So, which is why, it kind of rolled out for a certain reason, but then it did give a lot of other benefits. So, ultimately, it promoted a lot of SDGs, gender equality, work opportunities, responsible consumption and production. That's again about, what is it that you consume, how do you actually throw it away? So that was also something that it brought about. Now, if you're interested in looking at more case studies, here is a link. I'll leave this presentation here. Please feel free to go to this link. There are n number of case studies out here as to how action in one has led to multiple other benefits. And it very clearly maps the interconnections as well. So I was talking about the scorecard right in the beginning, right? So now this is the SDG scorecard that came out. This is the latest report, 2022 report, where it scored globally. This is the way the SDGs are performing. Now, overall averages seems to have improved, right? But then the minute you look at specific goals, that's when you get indications of what's happening with them. Now, I won't get into each of these details. All that I wanted to show here was that when you see, as I mentioned, each of the goals had multiple targets. Now, if we pick no poverty, they had multiple targets which included eradication of extreme poverty, to building the resilience of poor, to creating sound policy frameworks, so on and so forth, right? Now, what does this translate to ultimately? How did they go about looking at it, and what really happened in the period? So what has been found is that between 2015 and 2018, global poverty rates had declined quite significantly. But then COVID happened. As we all know, everything came to a standstill, and there were a lot of upsets that did happen. The shock left. What happened was that more than 4 years of progress against poverty was actually derailed because of what happened here. And then there was unprecedented reversal in, because of rising inflation, because of the war in Ukraine. So both of these together ultimately have combined together. You see that there is an additional 75 to 95 million people living in extreme poverty as of 2022, right? So here, when you break down the larger picture into its elements, you see a very different picture. So you need to be cognizant of the fact that, yes, big numbers matter, but then what goes into the big numbers is what actually tells the story. We need to be able to kind of tease out information from these larger pictures that we do, very fascinating when you look at them. That's what is projected most of the times, but one needs to get behind those larger numbers. So poverty is one example. Likewise, if you look at responsible consumption and production, again, these are the multiple targets that are put out here, right? So you have everything from, sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources to substantial reduced waste generation through prevention. And RRR is not the Oscar movie, whatever, the movie that went to the Oscars. Here we are talking about reduce, recycle, and reuse, right? But it will leave I purposefully put that because, we will not forget it easily, right? So that's the reason I put it this way. But this is something each of us can actually make a difference in. So that's important for us to remember, of course. And a whole lot of other things also, including some of them which actually are connected to the climate action, which is inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, right? So these are, things that are interconnected. Now, although these goals are purposefully put for a certain reason, the targets do look at the linkages as you see here. And of course, ensuring awareness, ensuring sustainable development, and so on and so forth are also part of this. Now, if you look at the facts and figures as to this particular goal, you do see that in Eastern and Southeast Asia, there's been a steep increase in domestic material consumption. Now, this is a story in itself, it might seem like, okay, there is a huge increase, that's bad news. But then we also need to you might want to look at, okay, which countries are there in these, and then where the consumption is more. Now, a developing country obviously is going to consume more, right? So I think that's where you will be able to see as to why something is happening in a certain manner. That's important to look at again. And when you look at, of course, food as a commodity, total food available to consumers that's wasted at the household level is quite large. So this is across most of the world. And food ending in landfills, which is your waste generation, is generating about 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. Again, your climate action, that's goal 13. There's a link out there. Now here you're talking about consumption, but it has a linkage with climate action ultimately. So you see the numbers, and what we see is that around 90% of the countries, which is a good thing, that they are reporting education for sustainable development, being part of the curriculum and being part of the mainstreamed in the education policies. Moving forward, if we zoom down to India, which is the region of interest for all of us out here, India ranked about 121 in the latest ranking. And what do we see here? Again, the big picture shows that it's 121, but then it's good to also see where it performed well, where it stagnated, and where it's kind of gone down, right? Those are the messages that actually are important to look at. And what we do see is that the multiple areas where it's performed well is primarily climate action seems to have been the big picture. There's been a lot of action on that particular front. But when it comes to health, there's health also to some extent in certain components, it's performed well. But when it comes to waste, that's your consumption and sustainable cities and urban spaces, there seems to be a lot of issues out there, particularly with respect to air pollution. There you see a dip out there, which is why the overall score goes down, right? So that's where you will need to be breaking these into pieces and trying to look at the picture. Now, finally, what it translates to is what is the action, what is the government doing in these different aspects. Now, what you see is that this is government commitment and efforts for the scores to be in a certain manner. Now, you know the overall score, you also know the pieces of which are doing well, some which aren't doing well, and also you get a big picture about where India is and what is India doing in that particular aspect. So all put together, it does give us a clear picture as to where we are heading, and then where are the pieces and where are the interconnections. So that's something which emerges very clearly, and you do see that it's important to look at all of these in a connected manner and not just in isolation. Right? So that's very, very important. Some further reading you could do on each of these. So that's about the SDGs in itself. Now let's look at the ecosystem and the interconnections that we are wanting to talk about. From morning, we did hear quite a bit on, how do you look at the problem in its entirety. One is, of course, a very short-term vision that could actually spoil the entire game. Now, you could use technology for solving a problem, but if it triggers some other problem, then there is an issue there. Now, in the climate narrative, we call this as maladaptation, right? You do something to adapt to a certain change, but what it triggers is a larger problem in itself. So, which is, it's a bigger problem that one needs to tackle. So let's look at understanding the ecosystem itself, and then what are the synergies, opportunities, and what are the trade-offs as we move forward, right? So now, this is a biology textbook picture that some of you may be familiar with, but I think it kind of gives us a sense of where are the interconnections, what are the different things that one needs to be cognizant of, which is very important to be aware of. Now, first and foremost, let's understand what an ecosystem itself is, right? So, for which, we again have to rely on some definitions that have been made. Now, an ecosystem is basically a geographic area where it's not just humans, we are talking about all life, right? When I say plants and animals, it's not just the large mammals or the trees that we are talking about, the microflora, the microfauna, some of it that we are aware of, some of it which we do not know, some of them that's visible, some of them that's invisible. All of these are very, very important. And this interaction between the various components of the system and the feedback that happens is what an ecosystem is all about. And the scale of an ecosystem could range dramatically. It could be the soil in your potted houseplant that you have. That's an ecosystem in itself. Because there is carbon, there is energy uptake, intake, there's water intake, uptake, right? And then there is also a whole lot of microorganisms in that potted soil as well. Now that's an ecosystem. And it could even be as vast as an African savanna, the grasslands. So the scale is very different, but yet it is an ecosystem. It could be very small, micro, to an extremely macro environment that we are talking about. And these ecosystems have multiple, what they call as biomes. We know deserts, right? We talk about grasslands, we talk about forests. All of these are called biomes. And when they are all put together, you have an ecosystem. So that's an illustration, right? You have one organism, you have a population, you have a community, and then that, when mixed with the abiotic, becomes an ecosystem. It includes your weather pattern, your temperature, your soil conditions. Everything put together is what makes up an ecosystem. And then there's a fine difference between biome and an ecosystem, right? So just to kind of state the difference, one basic difference is that multiple ecosystems can fit within a particular biome. So it's a subset. That's all you need to remember, right? So it kind of fits in. So this basically tells you that there are multiple biomes within this ecosystem. And all of them interact with each other constantly. And there's also a classic argument that keeps on going. We call it the biome versus biome argument. Now, what is it that you see on the top? What do you call that? Those pictures out there. Sorry? Forest? Okay. That's a forest, yes. No doubt about it. Most people will agree. But then there are also people who say that, is that a single biome or are there multiple biomes? Because forests, again, could be very dry forests, right? Which you call as deciduous. Or it could be wet, evergreen, rainforests. That could also be a forest. And over and beyond that, you could also have these other ecosystems. There are deserts, there are grasslands, there are savannas, freshwater and marine, not just the terrestrial, even the water, right? That's also an ecosystem in itself. Now, how do they actually work? Why are we talking about these interactions? This is your food chain. Again, it's school science, but it's very important. That's where all the interconnections emerge from. Now, there is a flow of nutrient through the food chain, right? So the exchange is what makes those interconnections. And we also know that one is very important for the other, right? You remove one segment, it's just like the SDG wedding cake. It's as simple as that. Now you have these producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, or carnivores, or whatever you call them. But then each of them are important for the next level of life. So that's where these are important. So healthy, well-balanced ecosystems consist of multiple interacting food chains or food webs. It's not linear, it's a network. So that's where it's important to know that there is influence of one on the other. So it's not just within species, it's between species, it's also across the entire system that it happens. Peter Wolleben, in his book, it's a very interesting book which talks about the hidden life of trees, where he talks about trees communicating with each other through the root system. Now, these root systems are covered with, fungi. It's a form of life, of course. Now, what they do is these filaments penetrate the soil, and they weave a network. And this is their ways of communication. So it's a very interesting book. Pick it up and read if you can. It kind of gives you insights about what are the different things that we probably even don't know or don't understand, comprehend, even today, despite a lot of research that has gone on in basic science. So which is where basic science is as important as innovation. Both have a role to play. Both are extremely important. Both need to be taken for what they are actually done for, right? And then comes, once you have a level of understanding, then there is a possibility to see how can one use it for the benefit of society. If you don't have the basic understanding, then it kind of, you do not know, you're clueless, right? So which is why it's good to invest on basic science. That has its own role to play, but at the same time, innovation is also important because there are some real-life problems that need to be solved. It can't wait for the best of science to emerge. So that's where these are extremely important. So now comes the services that come out of these various ecosystem biomes that we are talking about. So here, we do depend on the natural resources for a whole lot of things. Right? Now, it could be what we call as provisioning services, which is the food we eat, the fodder for the livestock, right? The wood and timber that you collect. These are all provisional services. You're depending on these systems for day-to-day life. Now, the other is the supporting services. These are extremely essential to your nutrient recycling, your photosynthesis, food production. If you are vegetarians, obviously food production has to happen, right? And not just vegetarians, even carnivores, because the food also, if X grows, only Y can grow. That's the relation out here, right? So water cycling, photosynthesis, nitrogen cycle, everything comes under the supporting services. Then comes your cultural services. This brings in recreation, ecotourism. These are man-made systems where people depend, people find avenues to do supporting jobs, skills that they are built, and they kind of have ethical and existence values also. There are tribal communities which are very closely linked to certain systems, right? So they attach a whole lot of existence values, ethical values, a cultural value, aesthetic value to it. So, and spiritual and religious values also. Now, there was this discussion on religion versus science, right? And traditional knowledge versus so-called scientific knowledge. Now, these have very important roles to play. It all depends on what you're looking at, the lens through which you are looking at probably. Now, for instance, if you are looking at, say, cultural values, the spiritual and the religious value, we do know. How many of you know that there are some places in India which have something called sacred groves? Yeah? So these sacred groves are nothing but, they usually a deity is attached to that particular space where it is conserved. And communities around these groves have stringent rules with respect to the use. It is with respect to, who can go in, to what are the instruments that they can carry in, which basically means to say they cannot carry an axe, primarily because they do not want the tree to be cut. Now, the interesting fact is that a lot of these sacred groves also have a socio-economic history attached to it. Now, during my initial days of my career, I was looking at what is called as community forest management in India. Now, what we found is that in parts of Orissa, this is a place called Gadabanikilo. Now, what they did is they had these sacred groves. They had community managed forests. Now, when you talk to people in the region, what we find out is that how did that come about? Although now it's called a sacred grove, the reason they started protecting it is at a given point in time, they could not find enough wood for lighting the pyre even. It was exhausted. People had over-extracted it to that extent that even for pyres, they had to buy wood from a distant place. So then they decided, enough is enough, we need to be protecting the forest. That was one of the triggers. The other one was grazing. They had enough livestock, but they didn't have enough fodder. And they realized, this is again traditional knowledge, that if they selectively start protecting patches. Now, they did a very intelligent thing at that time. They had about 85 to 88 hectares that they were protecting, 5 villages together, cohesively. But what they did is they did not enclose the entire 85 hectares. They did rotational protection. So which meant you close one, you allow that patch to regenerate. There is grass growth, there is seedling regrowth that happens, there are natural dispersal that happens, right? If people are using it continuously, if you trample it, then obviously your seedlings are dead. It cannot grow. So what they did is they selectively rotated. So over a period of time, they were able to recover that piece of land. So here again, traditional knowledge played a very important role. So there is the value of traditional knowledge. And the second is people understood that there is an interconnection between what we do, society does, to the resource itself. And they decided that this is the way to manage the patch. And that very clearly came out through these community managed forests. And spiritual and religious values attached to a patch, it's great. If it's leading to conservation, well and good. It really doesn't matter, right? And then, of course, the most important is the regulating services, which is to do with climate regulation, air quality regulation, water purification. See, forests are extremely important when you're looking at water sources, right? In Karnataka, 8 of the west-flowing rivers have their origin in the Western Ghats. Now, if the forests were eliminated, we lose the water. If the water is eliminated, then you lose all the downstream agriculture that's dependent on these water sources. So everything goes for a toss. So it's all an interconnected system at the end of the day. Of course, what is also lost is the habitat for a lot of biodiversity. It could be birds, it could be some tree species which are extremely endemic, which when I say endemic, they exist only in certain patches because the temperature, the soil moisture, and the rainfall is congenial for allowing its best growth. It cannot survive elsewhere. Now, these are completely lost from the system when you lose these patches and a whole lot of other biodiversity as well, right? So these are the multiple services that come out of these, and all of these are interlinked as well. So if you look at the ecosystem landscape, you have the natural system, the natural resources and their own functions, but you also have a whole lot of societal gains that come out of it, the societal needs that are met because of these various ecosystems. So that's extremely important to keep in mind whenever you think about the larger ecosystem, the interconnections, the benefits that come out of it at the end of the day. So they were standalone, but then just pay some attention to this. They're all interlinked. One goes to the other. and you kind of skewed one segment of it, you're skewing with a whole lot of this. Now, the classic example is, I take a lot of examples of forestry because that's what I specialized in. But it's important also, and it's interesting. I lived in this region called Sirsi, which is in the Western Ghats, of course. And I spent 3 years out there. Of course, I did research for almost 15, 20 years in that particular region. Now, what we saw was that we were studying the forest ecosystems, but we were also looking at socioeconomic dependence of people on the forest. 80% of people in the region depend on the forest for one form of produce or the other, right? It could be firewood, it could be fodder, it is also for leaf manure in the region because it's a region which grows areca, right? That's a supari tree, right? So what they do is they use a lot of leaf litter from the forest floor, they sweep it, and they put it at the base of the areca tree. It's a cash crop, by the way, right? It's a cash crop. So why do they do it? That's to retain moisture. When they put it at the base on the roots, right? So it kind of, especially in summers when it becomes extremely hot, the soil moisture retention is a problem. So which is why they use it. Now that's a produce that's very, very important for the farmers who have these areca lands. Now apart from that, there are a whole lot of agriculture farmers who collect what is called as poles, right? Certain size of trees are cut, and what they do is they fence their agricultural lands. Now these agricultural land fencing, it's a very interesting thing because there's only a certain species that they want because it lasts for several years. The lifetime of that wood is slightly larger, and only a certain size is what they actually prefer. Now, when we do a forest study, right, I'm studying a 1 hectare of forest. I don't really interact, let's say, with the people who are living there. Now, what I see is over a period of time, when I studied for 15 years, I see that a certain species, certain variety of a tree is dwindling over time. Large trees remain, but I see less and less of these smaller ones over time. Now, I'm clueless as to why it's happening. If I do not interact with the people, if I do not understand the use of that particular species, I might end up saying that there is, by the way, there is something called tip dying and mortality because of climate change. Now, at a time when we are looking at the problem of climate change, I can go and conclude, okay, climate change is a reality in this region. These species are disappearing. But that's not really the fact. People depend on it. They're extracting it. And since their preference is a certain size, the size class that has to grow to a certain level is completely missing. So obviously, you do not have certain sizes of trees in that particular patch. Now, when you put a simple map, this is about communication. All you need to do is put a pictorial graph of it, a bar chart, and then sit with the communities, talk to them and try and understand. They are able to tell us, oh, this is the species that we extract for fencing our lands. We know what the problem is. And then they realize that only if they continue doing what they are doing, they might not have it in the future. A, they look for alternatives. B, they say, okay, we will do some selective management of the patch. So there are insights that people get when you look at these interconnections. Now, likewise, you also see that when you kind of don't think about in a long term, habitat loss has larger repercussions. Now, again, from the same region, this is to do with pollination. Now, how many of you know that under a climate change scenario, bee populations are dwindling? Any raise of hands? You might have read it somewhere. Yes? Bee populations dwindling because of climate change? No? Nobody's read? Yes, right? So why do you think that's happening? Any thoughts? I mean, you can think aloud. There's no right or wrong. We are here to just broaden our understanding. Okay. Okay. You read about that somewhere? Okay. Okay. Interesting. I didn't know that angle. See, there's a learning. Maybe that is true. I don't know. I need to read up to. But the fact remains that these bee populations dwindling is because of certain tree species disappearing from the habitats. And secondly, the flowering patterns are changing, right? And most of the places, the agricultural lands are usually, at least in the hill districts, are adjoining these forest lands. And pollination happens when the bees are there. Now, if you don't have a certain species, and if you don't have flowering at certain seasons, which is coinciding with the cropping pattern, you might be aware that agricultural crops, they have a certain life cycle, right? The growth phases are determined. After a certain time, you need some rain, then there is flowering, then there's fruiting, a whole lot of things that happen. Now, for which pollination has to happen. Now, one classic case is the case of vanilla. A lot of us like vanilla ice cream. I mean, it's a flavor, right? It's a fantastic flavor. Now, what happened is that in that particular region, people started cultivating a lot of vanilla at a given period of time. Now, after some time, the production kind of reduced all of a sudden. Now, people were wondering what really happened. And farmers had gone, agog, and they said, okay, even I'm going to cultivate. And they were extensively cultivating, and suddenly they found that the pods, the vanilla pods, were not being produced. And what they saw is because of pollination was not happening. Believe me, I've seen farmers with bees in their bee boxes going from one plant to another actually pollinating because they wanted to produce those vanilla pods. Now, habitat destruction can do that. So this is the fine interlinkages, right? And even when you think about climate change problem, most of the time we think it's far, but the fact of the matter remains that it's here, it's today. It's going to impact all walks of life. It's not an additional problem. It's a problem which is intersecting everything that we are doing in the name of development, in the name of conservation. So which is why it's important to look at that problem in its totality and not think that it's an additional problem. Because it's a very fine line that determines what actually is going to be the outcome. So moving forward, one another example, I put the mangroves because Tamil Nadu government announced a wetland mission, right? The Tamil Nadu Green Climate Company was set up, TNGCC, and they have multiple missions. They have a climate mission, they also have a wetland mission. And as recently as yesterday, I saw an announcement that they have kind of restored some X number of hectares of mangroves in some place. And I think very close to Chennai, there is Pichavaram mangroves, right? It's a fantastic tourist spot. A lot of people go there, I know. So now these mangroves have an important role to play. I mean, they're not there just because they are there, but they also perform a lot of important functions out there. One is they provide the nursery ground for numerous marine species. Therefore, they replenish the vital fish stocks. They also act as a sink trap to filter out pollutants in water. Now, you think of mangroves as just a forest, but then look at the functions it's doing. More importantly, it also acts as a coastal barrier, particularly when you are looking at a wetter future. We are seeing more and more of extreme events, right? Heavy rainfall events, flooding that's happening. Now, in such cases, mangroves are fantastic natural barriers. They are able to kind of significantly reduce soil erosion, and which is to do with land degradation ultimately, and protect shorelines against tsunamis and other storms. So they are able to kind of do these multiple functions, so which is why looking at this ecosystem and the functions that they perform, now there is an economic angle also because people do depend, they collect wood, they sell, they make some produce and sell also. There are communities dependent on these systems. So which is where it becomes extremely important to understand that it impacts the social systems, it also impacts the economic systems, although we are talking about an environmental issue out here. Now, one change in the other, I think we've seen lots of examples already, so I'm not going to talk about this, but just look at this. Some could even have positive impacts. It's not necessary that it's always negative, right? So if you have forest densification, people do talk about improving green cover, right? We do have policies in India which is talking about improved green cover. Now, if you have better green cover, you're talking about better water bodies, fish capacity improving. You're also talking about carbon storage. Now, in the light of climate action, improving carbon storage, which is through tree cover, becomes important, right? And do you want me to explain how we say plants store carbon? It's clear, right? Obviously. So carbon sequestration, they are the natural sinks of carbon, right? And similarly, there are a whole lot of other things that could happen. So these are the fine interconnections. So then now let's come to the biggest problem that each one of us are, we keep reading, more so in the months of November, December, which is to do with the Conference of Parties, the COP that happens, which is climate change, right? I'm sure it's part of your course also, at least for some of you. So the climate problem we know, as I said, is here and now, and to achieve this, there are fundamental changes which are required across nearly all major systems. Any sector that you pick up, you need to bring about some changes. And cross-cutting transformations are what are required. Now here again, these are again interconnected systems, There are political, social, and economic systems that are all needed to work together to solve the climate problem. Now for which we need to understand, let's look at India itself. Let's understand India's position. Where do we stand with respect to this? Now, we do have climate policies and very proactive policies in place, but then it is housed under two broad things that India always talks about, which is we have very low per capita emissions, and because we have not consumed as much as the developed countries in the past. Secondly, we do want to be part of the solution because we are bearing the brunt of climate change, which is all these extreme events, heat waves, flooding events, and droughts in some parts of India as well. And then, of course, we have some commitments even at the global level, which is to do with the Paris Agreement and what is called as the NDC, or Nationally Determined Contribution. Now, housed under this is also the policy landscape. So the NDC was a policy that India put forth. It said, okay, we're going to be addressing the problem. This is what we're going to be doing. But it also said that, please note, this is very important, we have an aspirational GDP growth, which means to say India needs to develop. We need to be moving, but at the same time, we also need to be doing actions that are not going to be exacerbating the problem of climate change. Climate change is a global problem. Everybody needs to do something or the other. Just India doing an action is not enough, but at the same time, we need to be acting on it as well. Now, for addressing climate change, it's a two-pronged approach. You can't do away with one. One is you need to cut down the emissions, which is what we call as mitigation. Either you cut down the emissions or you compensate it in some way. The other is adaptation, where you have to make certain adjustments to some level of change that is bound to happen, even if the best of actions are rolled out in the coming years, right? You do slow down the process, but still you will need to adapt. So given that we need to address the problem of climate change, and given that India is still an aspiring, developing country, you need to be able to balance climate and development. Now, this is a very fine balance in itself. It's because you're looking at quality of life that Jay mentioned. The desired quality of life is something that we need to ensure as a developing country. At the same time, we want economic growth also. Human development goals have to be met. But at the same time, you can't ignore climate, because like COVID derailed development, climate will also derail development. So you need to be putting together strategies which look at these interconnections. So which is why it's a fine balance that needs to be put in. So I'm going to finally finish with a small example here, which is to do with the interconnected world we live in, addressing the problem of climate change itself, how ignoring some connections, whether in the natural world or in the actions that we do, could trigger multiple issues. Let's look at transport emissions. How do you think we can address the problem of transport emissions? What's the government doing? Let's say in the city of Chennai. Yeah? Electric vehicles, right. Any others? Better public transport. Right. Okay, great. So that's one part of the solution we're talking about. So electric vehicles, yes, that's an answer. But then it also leads to electricity demand, right? Which will lead to power sector emissions. Now, power sector emissions is a big problem in itself. You need to cut down on fossil fuels. Here is a linkage here. Now, we need to make sure that the EV targets are calibrated to the extent and rate of what they call as grid decarbonization. All that it means is that you need to be able to match the demand and the production and then try and see how do you do it. Now, alternatively, you can also look at what is called as a biofuel route, right? Tamil Nadu had a lot of jatropha that was grown at a point in time, right? That's a biofuel, right? So that's something that they looked at. Now, but for growing biofuels, there are land and water constraints because it's on cropland that you might need to do, or if you're looking at sugarcane, right, being used for biofuel production, ethanol production ultimately, then you're compromising on food production. That's not okay, right? So which is why you need to be able to build a policy which is calibrated to look at the balance. You cannot compromise on certain things, but at the same time, it's an alternative. So you can't put all your eggs in one bag. That's all is the message. You need to be able to look at multiple ways of solving the problem and also trying to see which is the best way to look at the interconnection. Now, alternatively is somebody talked about public transport, right? Now, public transport is one way. The other is how can we make the urban cities, urban forms much more compact, which reduces our commute, right? So then it can happen, but then it will have cooling energy demands that would increase. You have more compact buildings, high-rise buildings that come in, then you're with climate change, with more heat waves, obviously your demand for cooling also increases. That again has pressure on the grid. So can we think of open green spaces and alternate construction material? Right? So here, so even in the built environment, like we see in the natural environment, there are interconnections. So all I'm trying to impress upon you is that we need to be looking at things in a much more holistic manner rather than looking at a single issue. So which is why you need to be looking at what are the interventions. Are they the basket of interventions? Are there any trade-offs? Is it going to impact something in turn, positively or negatively, whatever that is? And thirdly, how do you look for strategies to minimize the trade-off? Now, this is what we do as scientists. As journalists, for you, when there is a policy that comes in, try to apply that lens into the problem and then try and see, okay, here is a policy. What does this mean for the environment? What does this mean for people? What does this mean for jobs? Right? So I think that is the message that I wanted to impress upon when I'm talking about these interconnections. Right? And I completely would admit to the fact that as they say, climate change or science in itself is a communication problem. We need to have more conversations. It needn't be just these kind of colloquiums. You're going to be full-fledged journalists over time. Have your own connections in the scientific world. Keep the conversation going. See, the science doesn't happen overnight. It evolves over time. So it's good to be clued into the different stages of the way it's evolving, and also what is the trigger, what is taking them so long. So it also helps you to kind of understand what goes into the science before you start criticizing something that's happening. So it's important to kind of get that understanding, have that, build your own set of connections. At C-STEP, we encourage this. We try to have these connections with a few journalists who report. See, many a time what we've realized is that come the climate COP, come the biodiversity convention, then you have a host of journalists reaching out to people, researchers at C-STEP and trying to get quotes. Okay, what does this mean? What does that mean? That's fine, but at the same time, I think what we should be giving is having a constant conversation. which also helps us as scientists to understand the societal point of view also. It's not a one-way traffic. It's two-way. Probably, when you ask certain questions, it might help us to look at the problem that we are trying to solve in a better manner, right? And I think as it was presented, the Kolkata case that he presented, Aparajit, there was a conversation before they actually took a decision on the bridge that was built, which is why, what really impressed me in that, the pictorial illustration that he gave, he talked about the economics. I also saw an environmental issue there. The soil that was disturbed was minimal in the particular design that they actually adopted. So that was also one of the reasons. So there are ways to look at the problem. There are conversations that can happen which bring in people from different paths. And everybody can get involved in science. So finally, when you do science, you're doing it for a certain reason. To better your understanding or for societal gains, whatever that is. But having these conversations are extremely important. So finally, I will leave you with this. I'm sorry, I don't know how that into came in there. It's crept up. So basically, whether it is the built capital, the human capital, or the natural capital, or the social capital, everything interacts. And human well-being is dependent on all of these different things. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that all of these are interconnected, and we need to be able to understand these nuances. We cannot understand everything in totality. Just build your right set of connections. Have those constant conversations rather than waiting for the big splash that happens, after which you start running to the concerned people. Thank you very much.
Hi, ma'am. Ma'am, recently at the COP27 summit, there was a creation of loss and damage fund.
Yeah.
And which is being pushed by developing countries like India, and the West and the developed world was like resistance to that because they have to push millions and billions of rupees in that, right? So my question is this, who share the responsibility, right? As an Indian, you can say that these developed world, right, they use these same technologies to get them developed. They colonized us, they took away everything from us. Now it's time for developing countries to grow, and now they're like pushing the responsibility on us. So who share the responsibility? And my second question is this, it is actually feasible to get rid of the zero emissions, because we see recently there was a huge shortage of coal in the world. There was blackouts in China, and due to the Ukraine war, you see that Germany is going back to the coal again, right? So the whole things got back again to coal, right? So how it's feasible actually to like?
Okay, so I'll address the loss and damage question first. See, this differentiated but shared responsibility, this has been happening from the day one of the climate negotiations. People can keep on saying X has to do action and stop doing nothing. But the problem is, let's also admit that although, yes, because of the way countries in the developed world developed and emissions increase, we are facing the wrath of climate change, true. But the problem is attributability. It's very hard to define that a certain extreme event is because of climate change, right? So that's the biggest problem. And see, it's a political game at the end of the day, no doubt about it. They will push back. If anybody has to shell out money, they try to avoid it as much as possible. And given that India is developing and we're fast going in that track, we were also named that India also has to pay for it. But we pushed back. But the point here is that the metrics are still evolving. People are not very clear. We are demanding for loss and damage. I think for least developed and island countries, yes, it is a huge issue. Yes, there is a compensation that's required. But here again, as I said, the metrics of it, how do you measure, how do you attribute, is the biggest problem. Now, moving to your other question of net zero, is it realistic? I don't know. But the fact remains that, this particular goal setting is at least pushing action in the right direction. To me, I think that's what matters. And this is where innovation comes in. See, we are talking about 2050, 2070. The way technology is developing, you don't know what is actually possible, right? So there is a lot that is happening, be it hydrogen, be it in the agriculture, right? So there's a lot that's happening. Even the EV, the batteries, right? We are doing research at C-STEP on, looking at these storage systems. What does it mean? What about using hydrogen for freight? Because freight is where a lot of emissions happen. Transportation, right? So rather than individuals using. So that way, there's a lot on the anvil, right? So there, if technology unfurls, then probably, yes, we can. But I still think, even if it's going to happen at a certain time, we do not know, but it is at least moving action in the right direction. At least policies, governments are thinking about it. They're putting, and all said and done, like I always say during all my talks, think about this as an icing on the cake. You anyway need to do certain things for sustainable development. Why can't you do it in a low carbon pathway? Ultimately, you're achieving the twin goals of development and climate. So I think it's fine. It's not an added burden at the end of the day. You anyway need to do, but just make sure. See, it is also a win-win because let's say you're making an investment on a large infrastructure, right? And if you are taking into consideration the climate, what is going to happen in the future, there are models available which can project for the next 30, 50 years. You're basically climate-proofing your investment, right? So that way, it's again a win-win. So I would think whether we actually achieve it or not, time will say, but it definitely is promoting positive action, which is what I think we should be looking at.
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah.
That's a great, insightful lecture. We often highlight the community management of forests and all. And also we are highlighting sustainable development goals and what the developed countries have to do, what the developing countries have to do and all. My primal question is that in a country like India, or for that matter any developing country which is very fertile and very rich in natural resources, one thing that is common is that hybridization of seed banks. And the crops are mostly like cash crops and mostly exported. And the people often who are the local folks, especially the tribal people, or even for that matter who are like middle class, majority of the middle class folks, they often are not the fruit bearers of that hybridization of seeds or something. But in their places, soil degradation happens. Like, how would you make us understand that our soil is degraded for the sake of others, that those are not the fruits of us? And how could we address this issue? And we often do highlight all these big goals like SDG goals and all. And one more question is that, yeah, that's it.
Okay, so this is a tricky question. See, when we talk about agriculture specifically, see, it's an individual farmer's decision at the end of the day. Agricultural policies, you can't make a blanket policy which stops something or which promotes something. But yes, some of the policies could be made in such a way that it discourages certain activities. But the point here is that soil degradation, no one better than the farmer can understand what's happening to his soil, right? So that's something you and I don't have to go and tell them. They definitely understand that. But the question here is aspiration, right? So unfortunately, people in the rural want to mimic the urban. People in the urban, we want to mimic the West. So it's a vicious cycle at the end of the day, which is where conscious production, conscious consumption, everything comes in. Now, there is no single answer to it. But I think if we can showcase stories around people, how people kind of, for example, zero-budget natural farming, that's happened in Telangana, Andhra. I always get confused. One of the states, okay? I know it as Andhra Pradesh, yes, right. So ZBNF, so there, they've actually enrolled farmers, made them switch back from fertilizers to using very natural ways of farming. And they've done it at scale. And there's been a ripple effect. There's been a demonstration. There's been a lot of stories on that. And people have been able to influence. So a lot of it is about demonstration, and communicating and also having those conversations. And there is no dearth of civil societies which work very closely with lots of communities. So I think they will also need to be made aware of, what are the repercussions of continuing to do what they are doing. And then probably, we will have better ways and people will start dealing with the problem in the way it has to be dealt with. Yeah? Yes, please.
Thank you, ma'am. We usually call EV like the means of sustainability, but can we ignore the fact that EVs leave behind the similar amount of carbon footprint, for example, the production of batteries?
Well, that's something, at C-STEP they are looking into. So yes, I mean, it seems like a panacea, but the problem is also about, one part of the problem is what you talked about, but the other is, scrapping old vehicles. We are looking at what do we do with that waste, right? That waste has to be managed. Otherwise, that's again a problem in itself. So there are various studies. I'm not an expert on EVs or research on that, but I'm sure, there are groups like even within C-STEP, we are looking into these issues where we look at sustainability, the circular economy, as they call it, right? So for example, solar PV panels. It has a certain life. When you dispose them of, what next? Right? So those are the kind of questions, think tanks. We are not the only ones. There are a lot of groups in India which are looking into these issues. But yes, there needs to be a lot more that needs to be looked at. And I think I really like your question because you're thinking about not just the immediate gains, but then what happens in the long run. So that's what needs to be in place in whatever we look at.